April 1945. Western Germany. The war that once thundered across Europe is collapsing into silence. A column of German soldiers walks slowly along a dirt road outside a small town near the Rhine. Their uniforms are dusty, their boots worn thin from weeks of retreat. Many carry nothing, no rifles, no helmets, only small packs slung over their shoulders. Ahead of them stands a temporary American processing camp. Barbed wire fences stretch across a muddy field. A few guard towers rise above rows of olive-drab tents. Military police watch the approaching prisoners, rifles slung casually across their chests. The German soldiers move forward cautiously. For years they had been warned what capture would mean. Allied troops, they were told, would seek revenge, torture, humiliation, death. But as the prisoners reach the camp entrance, something unexpected happens. An American soldier gestures toward a wooden crate. Inside are cigarettes. Another man pours hot coffee from a large metal container into tin cups. Nearby, a field kitchen hands out slices of bread. No shouting. No beatings. Only routine. The German soldiers stare in stunned silence. Because in this quiet moment, something far larger than their defeat begins to unravel. But to understand why such simple gestures could shatter years of belief, we must first step back into the world that shaped those beliefs in the first place. Long before German soldiers encountered American troops face to face, the war had already shaped what they believed about them. From the earliest days of the Third Reich, propaganda was not simply an accessory to power. It was a central pillar of the Nazi state. Joseph Goebbels, the regime's minister of propaganda, understood that controlling perception was as important as controlling territory. Every medium carried the message. Newspapers repeated the same narratives daily. Radio broadcasts reached millions of households. Posters appeared in train stations, factories, and schools. Films shown in cinemas portrayed Germany as the defender of European civilization against hostile enemies. For soldiers entering the Wehrmacht, this environment followed them directly into military life. Training did not focus only on weapons or tactics. It reinforced ideology. German troops were reminded constantly that the war was an existential struggle. The enemy was portrayed not merely as a rival army, but as a threat to the survival of the German people. Western Allied forces were described as decadent and morally weak, yet also capable of ruthless revenge. American soldiers in particular were often depicted in propaganda as undisciplined, driven by hatred and material greed. The message was clear. Capture would bring humiliation. For years, German soldiers heard these warnings repeatedly. Military manuals encouraged resistance to the end. Propaganda leaflets distributed at the front emphasized that surrender meant abandoning honor and risking brutal treatment by the enemy. At the same time, the war itself reinforced these fears. The conflict across Europe had been devastating. Entire cities were bombed. Civilians were killed in large numbers. German soldiers fighting on multiple fronts witnessed destruction on a scale few had imagined before the war began. By 1944, the situation had begun to change dramatically. After the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, American, British, and Canadian forces gradually pushed across France. German units fought fiercely in the hedgerows of Normandy, but the Allied breakthrough in August opened the road toward the German border. Paris was liberated. Allied armored columns advanced rapidly across Western Europe. Meanwhile, the war in the East had become catastrophic for Germany. The Soviet Red Army was pushing relentlessly westward, reclaiming territory lost earlier in the conflict. Entire German divisions were destroyed during massive Soviet offensives. German soldiers now faced the grim reality of fighting a war on two collapsing fronts. In the West, Allied aircraft dominated the skies. Fighter bombers attacked railways, convoys, and supply lines with increasing precision. The once powerful German war machine struggled to move troops and equipment as transportation. Networks collapsed under constant air attacks. Inside Germany, civilians endured nightly bombing raids. Factories burned. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden suffered massive destruction. Millions of Germans lost their homes. Food shortages worsened as supply chains broke down. Yet despite these setbacks, the Nazi leadership continued to promise eventual victory. Propaganda insisted that new weapons would change the course of the war. The V-1 and V-2 rockets were presented as signs that Germany still possessed secret technological advantages. Radio broadcasts encouraged soldiers and civilians to remain loyal and resist surrender. The message intensified as Allied forces approached German territory. The regime began calling for total war. Older men and teenage boys were organized into the Volkssturm, a desperate militia meant to defend the homeland. Soldiers at the front were urged to fight to the last bullet. Within this atmosphere, the fear of capture became even stronger. German troops understood that the war had brought enormous destruction across Europe. They were aware of the suffering experienced by occupied populations. Many assumed that Allied soldiers, having endured years of brutal fighting, would seek revenge when the opportunity came. So as the Western Front moved closer to Germany in late 1944 and early 1945, countless German soldiers carried a simple belief with them. If they were captured, mercy would be unlikely. But while German propaganda prepared soldiers for revenge, the armies advancing toward them operated under a very different set of expectations, one shaped by international law, military discipline, and long-standing procedures for handling prisoners of war. While German soldiers were conditioned to fear capture, the armies advancing toward them had already prepared for it. Long before Allied troops crossed into Germany, military planners in Washington, London, and Ottawa had developed procedures for managing prisoners of war on a massive scale. The expectation was clear. Once the German front began to collapse, large numbers of soldiers would surrender. Handling them required structure. The framework for that structure already existed in international law. The 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war outlined the basic rights and protections that captured soldiers were supposed to receive. Prisoners were to be protected from violence, provided with food and shelter, and allowed medical treatment when necessary. The United States and Britain formally committed to following these standards. This commitment was not only moral, but practical. Allied leaders understood that the war would eventually end with occupation and reconstruction across Europe. The treatment of prisoners could influence how quickly stability returned to the continent. So when Allied armies moved across France and Belgium in 1944, they carried with them not only weapons and ammunition, but also systems designed to process captured enemy soldiers. The process began immediately after surrender. German prisoners were first searched for weapons or documents. Military police recorded their names, ranks, and units when possible. Personal belongings were cataloged and stored. The information helped Allied intelligence officers understand the structure and movements of German forces still fighting nearby. Medical checks followed quickly. Years of war had left many soldiers wounded, exhausted, or sick. Doctors and medics examined prisoners for injuries and infectious diseases. Treating these conditions was essential not only for humanitarian reasons, but also to prevent outbreaks that could spread rapidly through crowded camps. Food distribution came next. Allied field kitchens operated as part of a vast logistical network that stretched across the Atlantic Ocean. Cargo ships delivered enormous quantities of supplies, flour, canned meat, coffee, sugar, and medical equipment to ports in Britain and later to the liberated ports of France. From there, trucks carried these supplies to forward bases, supporting the advancing armies. Even temporary prisoner camps were usually connected to this supply chain. When prisoners arrived, they were often given bread, soup, or coffee, simply because feeding them was part of the routine system. To Allied soldiers managing these camps, the procedure was unremarkable. But to the German prisoners entering them for the first time, the experience could feel strangely unexpected. Another factor shaped these encounters: military discipline. American and British commanders repeatedly emphasized that prisoners were under legal protection. Soldiers were instructed to treat captured enemies according to regulations. Acts of revenge or unauthorized violence could lead to punishment under military law. This discipline was particularly important as the war entered its final stages. Many Allied soldiers had spent years fighting across North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe. They had seen friends killed in battle. Entire towns had been destroyed by combat. Yet the command structure insisted that the war must end without descending into uncontrolled retaliation. So the system remained steady. Prisoners were processed. Camps were organized. Guards maintained order. Field kitchens continued to produce food for soldiers and detainees alike. By the time Allied forces crossed into Germany itself in early 1945, this machinery was operating at enormous scale. Entire German units were surrendering. Columns of prisoners marched along roads toward temporary enclosures built from barbed wire and wooden posts. Some camps held hundreds of men. Others held thousands. Inside those camps, the war felt strangely distant. Gunfire still echoed beyond the horizon. But within the fences, there were only routine roll calls, medical checks, and the quiet distribution of food and cigarettes. And it was in these ordinary routines that many German soldiers began to encounter something they had not expected. The enemy they had feared for years did not behave as the propaganda had promised. From that moment, several different perspectives began to emerge: human, logistical, and psychological. For many German soldiers captured in the final year of the war, the greatest shock did not come from defeat itself. It came from what followed. By 1944, the average German infantryman had already spent years inside one of the most intense conflicts in human history. Many had fought across multiple campaigns: Poland, France, the Soviet Union, Italy. Others had been drafted later as casualties mounted, and the war demanded fresh manpower. Regardless of when they entered the army, most shared the same informational environment. Propaganda surrounded them constantly. Military newspapers distributed at the front repeated official narratives about the enemy. Radio broadcasts from Berlin reinforced the same themes. Officers often repeated these ideas in speeches intended to maintain morale. The message rarely changed. German soldiers were told that their enemies sought the destruction of Germany itself. Capture, they were warned, could lead to humiliation or revenge for the years of occupation and devastation that German armies had brought across Europe. Stories circulated among troops. Some were based on real incidents of harsh combat. Others were exaggerated or entirely invented. Over time, these stories blended together, reinforcing a sense that surrender was dangerous. As the war turned against Germany, this fear intensified. By late 1944, many soldiers understood that victory was unlikely. Yet surrender still carried psychological weight. Some units continued fighting long after their positions were hopeless, partly because they feared what awaited them if captured. This mindset followed them even into captivity. When German prisoners first approached Allied camps, many expected interrogation or punishment. They anticipated hostility from soldiers who had spent months or years fighting them on the battlefield. What they encountered instead often felt confusing, because the environment inside those camps did not match the expectations they carried with them. And that difference became even clearer when compared to the vast logistical system supporting the armies that had defeated them. The United States Army, the German soldiers, countered in 1944 and 1945, was not only a fighting force, it was an industrial system. Behind every infantry division stood a network of supply routes, transport units, warehouses, administrative offices designed to sustain millions of soldiers operating thousands of miles from home. American factories produced enormous quantities of equipment during the war: rifles, tanks, trucks, aircraft, radios, uniforms. But just as important was the production of food and basic supplies. Millions of tons of provisions crossed the Atlantic Ocean aboard cargo ships. Canned meat, powdered eggs, coffee, sugar, flour, cigarettes, and medical supplies filled warehouse depots across Britain and later across liberated France. From these depots, trucks delivered daily shipments to units moving toward the front lines. Field kitchens became a familiar part of every encampment. Large metal containers brewed coffee for entire companies at once. Portable ovens baked bread. Mess tents distributed meals to soldiers at regular intervals regardless of weather or battlefield conditions. When prisoners of war began arriving in large numbers, the system adapted naturally. Feeding them was simply another logistical task. Field kitchens prepared extra portions, Water tanks were positioned near prisoner enclosures. Medical teams extended their services to anyone requiring treatment. For American soldiers responsible for managing these camps, the routine felt ordinary. But for German prisoners, many of whom had endured shortages and retreat during the final months of the war, the sight of such organized abundance was startling. It suggested something deeper than military strength. It revealed a level of industrial capacity and logistical planning that the collapsing German war machine could no longer match. And inside those camps, surrounded by the quiet efficiency of this system, small gestures began to carry unexpected meaning. Inside Allied prisoner processing camps, many interactions between guards and prisoners were brief and practical. Orders were given. Names were recorded. Lines formed and moved slowly from one table to the next. But within this routine, small gestures sometimes occurred that prisoners remembered long after the war ended. One of the most common involved cigarettes. For American soldiers during the Second World War, cigarettes were part of daily rations. Packs were distributed regularly alongside food supplies. They became a kind of informal currency, traded among troops, shared during quiet moments between battles. When German prisoners arrived in camps, some American guards occasionally offered cigarettes. The act required little effort. It was a simple extension of the routine generosity soldiers often showed toward one another during wartime. Yet for prisoners expecting hostility, the gesture carried unexpected emotional weight. A cigarette passed across a barbed wire fence. A cup of coffee handed to a tired soldier. A piece of bread given to someone who had marched for hours. These actions were not dramatic displays of goodwill. Most were quiet and informal, occurring between individuals rather than through official policy. But they contradicted years of propaganda. German soldiers had been taught that the enemy was cruel and vengeful. Yet the first American they encountered after surrender might simply be a young man offering tobacco or directing them toward a meal. For prisoners processing this experience, the contrast was difficult to ignore. And gradually, the psychological landscape of the war began to change. Propaganda thrives on distance. It becomes powerful when people rarely meet the individuals they are taught to fear. Stories grow stronger in the absence of direct experience. Rumors fill the gaps left by uncertainty. But captivity created a new kind of contact. German prisoners now lived within camps, supervised by the very soldiers they had been warned about for years. They observed daily routines, guards rotating shifts, cooks preparing meals, medics treating injured prisoners without discrimination. These observations did not erase the brutality of the war itself. Battles had been fierce. Entire cities had burned under bombing raids. Millions had died across Europe. The conflict remained one of the most destructive in human history, yet inside the camps, the expected atmosphere of revenge rarely appeared. Instead, there was procedure. Prisoners were counted during roll calls. Meals were distributed. Medical care was provided when necessary. The contrast between expectation and reality created doubt. And doubt weakened the narrative that had defined the war for many German soldiers. Some prisoners began speaking quietly among themselves about what they had witnessed. Others wrote letters home describing conditions inside the camps. These accounts gradually circulated among German communities after the war ended. The realization spread slowly but steadily. The enemy described in propaganda posters was not the same as the soldiers guarding the camps. War encourages people to see opponents as symbols, rather than individuals. Uniforms replace identities. National flags stand in for human lives. During years of conflict, German soldiers and Allied troops had encountered each other primarily through violent artillery fire, machine gun bursts, and tank battles across fields and forests. But captivity changed that relationship. Inside prisoner camps, the distance between enemy armies narrowed to a few meters of barbed wire. Prisoners could observe the daily lives of the guards watching them. They saw soldiers writing letters home. They heard laughter from nearby tents. They watched medics move quickly to treat wounded men regardless of nationality. These ordinary human details slowly replaced the abstract image of the enemy that propaganda had created. The transformation was rarely dramatic. It unfolded quietly over days and weeks. But as the war moved toward its final chapter in Europe, these small encounters prepared the ground for a moment when the scale of surrender would force both sides to confront the end of the conflict itself, because by the spring of 1945, events were unfolding that would bring millions of German soldiers face to face with the reality of defeat and the unexpected humanity of those who had defeated them. March 1945. The last great natural barrier protecting Western Germany is the Rhine River. For centuries, the Rhine had been considered one of Europe's most formidable defensive lines. German military planners hoped that if the river could hold long enough, it might slow the Allied advance and allow time to reorganize the shattered German army. But the reality of 1945 was far different from the confident strategies imagined years earlier. German forces were exhausted. Fuel shortages crippled armored divisions. Allied aircraft dominated the skies, attacking railways, bridges, and convoys moving through the shrinking territory of the Reich. Then, on March 7, 1945, an unexpected opportunity appeared. American troops from the 9th Armored Division reached the town of Remagen and discovered the Ludendorff Bridge still standing across the Rhine. German engineers had attempted to destroy it with explosives, but the demolition charges failed to collapse the structure. Within hours, American infantry rushed forward. Under artillery fire and the constant threat of demolition, the first soldiers crossed the bridge and secured a foothold on the eastern bank of the Rhine. Engineers quickly moved in to stabilize the damaged structure, while thousands of additional troops and vehicles poured across. The crossing shocked the German high command. For years, the Rhine had been presented as the final defensive wall of the Reich. Now Allied forces had breached it. Within weeks, additional crossings followed. American, British, and Canadian armies launched coordinated operations across the river at multiple locations. Temporary pontoon bridges appeared along the banks as engineers worked around the clock. Once across the Rhine, the Allied advance accelerated. Armored columns moved rapidly through Western Germany. Cities such as Cologne, Bonn, and Koblenz fell in quick succession. German units retreating eastward often lacked fuel, ammunition, or communication with higher command. Entire formations began to surrender. The most dramatic collapse occurred in the Ruhr pocket. During April 1945, Allied forces surrounded the industrial heartland of Western Germany, trapping approximately 325,000 German soldiers inside the encirclement. With supply lines cut and resistance increasingly futile, German commanders began ordering mass surrenders. Roads filled with columns of prisoners. Thousands of soldiers marched toward Allied positions, carrying white flags or simply raising their hands. Trucks and jeeps escorted them toward temporary holding areas established behind the advancing front lines. For many German troops, the moment felt surreal. Only weeks earlier, they had still believed that the war might continue for months. Now the structures of the German military were collapsing around them. Officers destroyed documents. Units disbanded. Weapons were abandoned in ditches along the roads. Among the prisoners were men from every branch of the German armed forces infantry. Artillery crews, engineers, and support personnel who had once operated the vast machinery of the Wehrmacht. As these soldiers approached the Allied camps, the fear instilled by years of propaganda remained strong. Many expected harsh interrogation or punishment. Some believed the enemy might seek revenge for the destruction Germany had brought across Europe. But inside those camps, something entirely different awaited them. And in the quiet routines of those prisoner enclosures, the psychological collapse of Nazi propaganda would reach its decisive moment. Spring 1945. Across Western Germany, Allied prisoner camps filled faster than anyone had expected. Fields, schoolyards, and abandoned military compounds were converted into temporary enclosures surrounded by barbed wire. Guard towers overlooked long rows of tents where newly captured German soldiers were gathered and processed. Every day more prisoners arrived. Columns marched along roads under the watch of military police. Trucks carried wounded men from the front. Some prisoners still wore full uniforms with helmets and equipment. Others had already discarded their weapons and belts before surrendering. Inside the camps, the process moved with methodical efficiency. Prisoners were directed toward registration tables where their names, ranks, and units were recorded. Documents were inspected. Personal belongings were cataloged. Guards searched each man for concealed weapons. Beyond the registration area, rows of prisoners waited quietly under the open sky. Exhaustion hung over the camp. Many had been marching or retreating for days. Some had eaten little more than emergency rations. Others had been cut off from supply lines entirely during the final battles around the Rhine and the Ruhr. Nearby, an American field kitchen continued its work. Large metal containers sat over portable burners, heating water and preparing food for soldiers and prisoners alike. The smell of coffee drifted across the enclosure. Eventually, the camp staff began distributing drinks and bread to the newly arrived prisoners. The act was simple and routine. Tin cups were filled and passed down the line. Bread was handed across the wire. For the American soldiers operating the kitchen, it was just another task in a long day of processing prisoners. But for the German soldiers receiving the food, the moment carried a strange emotional weight. Many hesitated. They had been warned for years that surrender meant humiliation. The enemy was supposed to hate them. Some expected insults or violence once they were safely inside the camp. Instead, they were being fed. One prisoner accepted the cup. Another reached for the bread. Soon, the entire line began eating and drinking quietly. The realization spread slowly. The enemy soldiers standing nearby were not shouting or threatening them. Some leaned against vehicles smoking cigarettes. Others continued working through paperwork at the registration tables. In several camps, American guards even passed cigarettes through the wire to prisoners who asked. These small gestures had an effect far greater than the soldiers offering them likely understood. Years of propaganda had portrayed the enemy as ruthless and vengeful. But the reality unfolding inside the camp contradicted that image in the simplest possible way. The guards were following procedures. They were maintaining order. And in many cases, they were treating prisoners with the same basic decency they extended to their own comrades. The psychological impact of this contrast was powerful. Defeat on the battlefield had already become unavoidable. But now, something deeper was collapsing. The narrative that had defined the war for many German soldiers, the belief that surrender meant destruction, was dissolving in real time. In its place appeared something unexpected. A routine system of captivity. A quiet recognition that the enemy was not the monster they had been taught to fear. And once that realization began to spread through the camps, the meaning of Germany's defeat started to change in ways that would shape the post-war world. When the fighting in Western Europe finally ended in May 1945, millions of German soldiers were already prisoners of war. The scale of the surrender was unprecedented. Across the Western Front alone, Allied forces had captured several million German troops during the final months of the war. Entire divisions had laid down their weapons as the German military structure collapsed under the pressure of advancing armies. Managing such enormous numbers of prisoners required rapid expansion of the camp system that had developed during the war. Temporary enclosures built near the front lines were gradually replaced by larger, more organized detention facilities located further behind Allied lines. Some camps occupied former German military bases. Others were constructed quickly using tents, wooden barracks, and extensive barbed wire fencing. In these camps, daily life followed a predictable routine. Morning roll calls confirmed the number of prisoners. Guards counted the men standing in rows inside the enclosures. Administrative staff recorded the figures and compared them with registration records. Meals were distributed at regular intervals. Field kitchens prepared large quantities of soup, bread, and coffee. The food was basic but consistent, drawn from the same supply chains supporting Allied armies throughout Europe. For many prisoners who had endured shortages during the final months of the war, even simple rations represented stability. Medical teams continued their work inside the camps. Doctors examined prisoners for injuries, malnutrition, and disease. Wartime conditions had left many soldiers weakened by exhaustion and poor nutrition. Treating these problems quickly was essential for maintaining order within the crowded facilities. Sanitation duties were organized among the prisoners themselves. Groups were assigned to clean living areas, maintain latrines, and distribute supplies. These tasks helped prevent outbreaks of illness and gave prisoners a structured routine during long days inside the wire. For many German soldiers, captivity brought a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. The immediate danger of combat had ended. Artillery no longer thundered across the horizon. The constant fear of air attacks and battlefield chaos had disappeared. Yet the future remained unclear. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. News of the collapse of Berlin and the death of Adolf Hitler gradually reached the camps through newspapers, guards, and occasional radio broadcasts. The state they had served no longer existed. Many prisoners struggled to understand what would happen next. Some worried about families living in cities devastated by bombing. Others wondered how long captivity would last. Letters slowly began to circulate through Red Cross channels, providing the first fragments of information from home. Inside the camps, conversations among prisoners often returned to the same subject, the unexpected reality of their treatment. Many had entered captivity expecting revenge or humiliation. Instead, they found themselves living within a system defined by procedures, regulations, and daily routines. The war had ended with defeat. But the end of the war was not the end of their story. Beyond the fences and guard towers, Europe itself was beginning to transform as Allied governments prepared to rebuild a continent shattered by years of conflict. As months passed after Germany's surrender, the vast system of Allied prisoner camps across Europe slowly began to shrink. Repatriation was gradual and carefully organized. Millions of German soldiers had been captured during the final phase of the war, and returning them home required functioning railways, food supplies, and administrative coordination things that were still being rebuilt across a devastated continent. Many prisoners remained in camps throughout 1945 and into the following years. During this time, daily routines continued much as they had in the final weeks of the war. Prisoners worked inside camp facilities, maintained sanitation areas, and occasionally assisted with labor projects organized by the occupying authorities. But the psychological environment inside the camps was changing. Information about the war's end began to circulate more clearly. Newspapers and official bulletins gradually described events that had been hidden from many. German soldiers during the final months of the conflict, they learned about the fall of Berlin. They learned about the death of Adolf Hitler in April 1945, and increasingly, they began hearing reports about the full extent of Nazi crimes uncovered by Allied forces, particularly the concentration camps liberated across Germany and Eastern Europe. For many prisoners, these revelations were deeply unsettling. The ideological certainty that had once shaped their understanding of the war was now collapsing. The regime they had served had not only been defeated but exposed as responsible for crimes on a scale difficult to comprehend. Within the camps, conversations among prisoners reflected this growing realization. Some men struggled to reconcile their experiences at the front with the atrocities being revealed in the news. Others questioned the propaganda they had heard throughout the war, and many remembered the moment when their own expectations had first been challenged, when the enemy they feared had treated them with unexpected restraint. Those small interactions inside the camps became powerful reference points in later years. Former prisoners later described how ordinary gestures, being given a cigarette, receiving medical treatment, sharing coffee with a guard, had forced them to reconsider the image of the enemy they had carried throughout the war. These experiences did not erase the bitterness of defeat. Germany had been devastated. Cities lay in ruins. Millions of civilians struggled to rebuild their lives amid shortages and political upheaval. But the encounters between prisoners and their captors offered a different perspective on how the war had ended. Victory had not led to immediate revenge. Instead, the defeated soldiers found themselves living within a structured system of occupation and administration that aimed to stabilize Europe rather than prolong destruction. When prisoners eventually returned home, many carried those memories with them. The war they had experienced, the enemy they had feared, no longer matched the narrative they had once believed. And in that quiet contradiction lay one of the most profound transformations of the post-war world. Wars often end in dramatic moments. Capitals fall. Leaders surrender. Documents are signed beneath the watchful eyes of generals and diplomats. These events become the symbols that mark the official conclusion of conflict. But the true end of a war often unfolds in quieter places. In the spring of 1945, millions of German soldiers laid down their weapons as the Third Reich collapsed around them. Years of propaganda had prepared them for a final, catastrophic confrontation with enemies who would show no mercy. Instead, many encountered something far more ordinary: system, barbed wire fences, registration tables, field kitchens, medical tense elements of an organized military structure designed not for revenge, but for control and stability. The soldiers guarding those camps followed procedures rather than passions. Small gestures carried unexpected power. A cigarette passed across a fence, a cup of coffee handed to a tired prisoner, a medic treating a wounded enemy without hesitation. These moments did not erase the devastation of the war. Europe remained scarred by destruction. Millions of lives had been lost. Entire cities lay in ruins. Yet inside those camps, something important was happening. The myths that had sustained the war were beginning to collapse. Propaganda had portrayed the conflict as a struggle between irreconcilable enemies. But when soldiers met face to face without weapons, the reality proved more complex. The enemy became human again. History often remembers the battles that end wars, but sometimes the deeper transformation occurs afterward, in the quiet interactions that reveal how propaganda, fear, and ideology can dissolve when confronted by ordinary human behavior. For many German soldiers, the shock of that realization began, not with speeches or political announcements, but with the simple discovery that the enemy they had been taught to fear could also show restraint, discipline, and unexpected kindness.